You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.
Good morning, Melissa. Good morning, Ramona. Good morning, Bernadette. Good morning, class, and good morning, cable audience. Welcome to Immigration in the United States, IDS 318. Now, we have learned in this course that the U.S. federal government supports both corporate and business needs for inexpensive workers and high profits. And since its inception, the United States has maintained groups of rightless workers. This course has viewed the historical experience of the different directions of humanity: red, white, black, yellow, and brown. We have studied the experience of the immigrant as slaves, colonial subjects, indentured servants, racial and ethnic minorities, and undocumented workers. The resounding theme throughout the study is that the federal government ensures people without rights for business. The United States practices exclusionary citizenship. It began with indentured servants. Then it moved to slavery. It is now called undocumented immigration, yet it is a contracted form of labor. We have witnessed disenfranchisement and dispossession of the immigrant worker, sprinkled with white racism. The fear of the other, the fear of the immigrant translates into policy that prevents people from achieving social justice and equality. Whites and Europeans were extended open immigration. They came as voluntary immigrants. Meanwhile, restricted immigration was created for everyone else. Africans endured enslavement. Asians experienced exclusion. Native people and Mexicans had to and have to deal with conquest. Aristide Zolberg writes that U.S. immigration and naturalization law is about creating a nation by design. And it is this nation by design that's most important so we can understand and appreciate what's going on today. So let's go to a film clip that helps us appreciate what's happened this past week.
In immigration news, President Trump said Sunday he won't restore the DACA program protecting hundreds of thousands of young undocumented immigrants from deportation unless lawmakers agree to expand the wall on the U.S.-Mexico border and move to keep out thousands of children fleeing gang violence in Central America. The Senate Democratic Minority Leader Chuck Schumer called the proposal a non-starter, tweeting, "Nancy Pelosi and I told POTUS we were open to reasonable border security alongside DREAM Act. His list goes so far beyond what's reasonable," unquote. In September, President Trump said the U.S. would stop renewing applications for DACA, that's the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, which gives nearly 800,000 undocumented immigrants permission to live and work in the United States.
Being a refugee is much more than a political status. It is the most pervasive kind of cruelty that can be exercised against a human being. You are forcibly robbing this human being of all aspects that would make human life not just tolerable but meaningful in many ways.
The more immune you are to people's suffering, that's very, very dangerous. It's critical for us to maintain this humanity.
Over 65 million people in the world today have been forcibly displaced from their homes.
I've been roaming endlessly with my son for 60 days now. Nobody has shown us the way. Where am I supposed to start my new life?
If children grow up without any hope, without any prospects for the future, without any sense of them being able to make something out of their lives, then they will become very vulnerable to all sorts of exploitation, including radicalization.
Why are you here?
We went for a stroll for fun. It's the only place to escape in the big prison of Gaza.
The officials came here and told them, look, there's no way you're going to get papers to continue. Either you go voluntarily or we arrest you.
Witness the global journey of millions of men, women, and children. Filmed across 23 countries.
When does it open?
We have to respect passport and respect.
It's going to be a big challenge to recognize that the world is shrinking and people from different religions, different cultures are going to have to learn to live with each other.
That's the trailer for the new documentary Human Flow. It's directed by Ai Weiwei, the internationally renowned Chinese artist. He'll be back with us live after break.
这一条路向西啊，一直往前走吧，快点儿翻个墙啊，路上的鲜花盛开呢，孩子你明天醒来，我在路上等着，这堵墙的那边有那么一片水啊，东方路的旅店好贵，朝阳医院比瞎子还黑，这条路的那边还是那堵破墙啊，沿途的旅店不咋地，可不要轻易进去，姑娘跟着他奶奶吧，爷爷。
Just Climb the Wall, sung and written by Ai Weiwei. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The United Nations says there are now more refugees worldwide than at any time since World War II. The journey and struggle of these 65 million refugees is the subject of Chinese artist and dissident Ai Weiwei's epic new documentary called Human Flow. For the documentary, Ai Weiwei traveled to 23 countries, dozens of refugee camps. He joins us now in our New York studio. And back in the United States, in Philadelphia, Mexican immigrant Javier Flores is slated to leave the Arch Street United Methodist Church, where he's taken refuge to avoid deportation for nearly a year. Javier Flores has been living in Philadelphia for 20 years as the father of 3 U.S.-born children. He took sanctuary only days after Donald Trump was elected president. Javier Flores has won an immigration hearing which will shield him from the threat of deportation for now. He's slated to walk out of the church today.
President Trump said Sunday he will not restore DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program that protects hundreds of thousands of young undocumented immigrants from deportation unless lawmakers agree to expand the wall on the U.S.-Mexico border and move to keep out thousands of children fleeing gang violence in Central America. Senate Democratic Minority Leader Chuck Schumer called the proposal a non-starter, tweeting, Nancy Pelosi and I told POTUS we were open to reasonable border security alongside DREAM Act. His list goes so far beyond what's reasonable.
In September, President Trump said the government would stop renewing applications for DACA, which gives nearly 800,000 undocumented immigrants permission to live and work in the United States. For more, we go to St. Louis, Missouri, where we're joined by Cesar Vargas, who is himself a DACA recipient, co-director of Dream Action Coalition, and New York State's first openly undocumented attorney. Cesar Vargas, welcome to Democracy Now! Usually you're in New York, but you're giving a talk in St. Louis. Respond to what President Trump has now proposed.
Well, the White House immigration demands are troubling and simply dangerous. What this president is simply seeking every opportunity on broadening how to deport, detain, and target more immigrants. And the bottom line is that this administration is essentially seeking assistance in persecuting one group of immigrants in exchange to pledging to protect others. It is asking me to be complicit in deporting my own mother in exchange for a green card. And you know, this demand, this deal, is dangerously fueling a narrative of good immigrant versus bad immigrant and pitting better educated academically immigrants against my own mother, against day laborers, against Central American children. And this toxic deal is simply one that we cannot accept because it is essentially targeting immigrants in exchange for just simply, well, we're going to protect other group of immigrants. And that's simply something that we cannot do. That's something that I cannot do to have my own mother at the crosshairs of this deportation regime.
And Cesar, a lot of attention is focused on the president's insistence on Congress funding the entire wall that he wants to build, but other aspects of what he's proposing, like drastic changes in the family reunification aspect of immigration law that would dramatically change the nature of who comes into the country. Could you talk about that as well?
Oh, absolutely. And what we're seeing is that this administration has always been targeting and demonizing undocumented immigrants, that immigrants are taking jobs. But what this administration is also doing is reflecting that nationalist, white supremacist agenda by Attorney General Jeff Sessions of targeting legal immigrants as well. So, he's trying to cut legal immigration to ensure that the parents, the spouses, sometimes the children of many of immigrant families to come together. That's un-American. This nation is founded on basic principles of keeping families together, on ensuring that people can seek a better opportunity and live the American dream. And this president, again, is seeking every opportunity to target, detain, and deport more immigrants, both undocumented and legal immigrants. And this is something that is a very, very dangerous potential deal that we hope the Democrats can push aside. And I get some of young people whose DACA protection, which is deportation relief and work authorization, it expires in a matter of a few weeks. And for me, my DACA expires in 2019. So I understand the urgency, but we cannot simply fall into this vicious cycle of, well, let's help one group of immigrants, or let's help the good immigrants, and let's target and persecute bad immigrants. And that's simply something that we cannot fall trap into, especially by this administration whose rhetoric has been divisive and dangerous when it comes to just simply every issue, not just in immigration.
And explain what you mean by this division of good immigrants and who the bad immigrants are.
Well, for me, it's easy for people to say, well, these dreamers, these DACA recipients who are in college, who are in law school, who are lawyers, who are doctors, engineers, those are the good immigrants according to what this administration has been saying. But that implies that, well, if these are the good immigrants, the desirable ones, we need to kick out the undesirable ones. We need to kick out the parents who brought these children here. We need to kick out the Central American children who, many of them are my clients. I represented many of them in immigration court. And this administration saying, well, we need to stop them. We need to prevent them from coming here, even though they're escaping unspeakable violence from countries whose murder rates are the highest, more than even some war zones. They're kicking out day laborers. So, I think it's pitting that division of the good immigrant versus bad immigrant. And what this administration is doing is simply saying, Caesar, I want you to be complicit in the targeting and persecution of those immigrants in exchange for a green card for you. And for me, that's simply something that I cannot accept. That's simply that we should not accept. And that's simply that the Democrats should be strong, and Republicans as well, as we are seeing a bipartisan support from both parties, from the American people in general, for a solution, an immediate solution, and about taking the first steps to passing the DREAM Act or some type of legislation. And then let's talk about a broader immigration reform. Let's talk about border security. Let's talk about ensuring that we keep our nation secure. And I think no one doubts that, but let's start with something that will provide an immediate solution for young people to ensure that they continue to go to school, they continue to go to college, and contribute to the country they call home.
A Louisiana sheriff has sparked outrage after he lamented the scheduled release of nonviolent prisoners using language that evoked slavery and the U.S.'s long history of imprisoning African Americans in order to serve as free or cheap labor. This is Caddo Parish Sheriff Steve Prador.
I don't want state prisoners, okay? They are a necessary evil to keep the doors open, that we keep a few or keep some out there. And that's the ones that you can work. That's the ones that can pick up trash, the work release programs. But guess what? Those are the ones that they're releasing. in addition to the bad ones, and I call these bad, in addition to them, they're releasing some good ones that we use every day to wash cars, to change oil in our cars, to cook in the kitchen, to do all that where we save money. Well, they're going to let them out.
In Portland, Oregon, 6 people were arrested Wednesday after they locked themselves to each other outside the Portland ICE Center to blockade a bus carrying detained immigrants to a for-profit immigrant prison in Tacoma, Washington. Meanwhile, in Washington state, 2 protesters have been convicted of disorderly conduct after they blockaded a highway to protest a rally by then-candidate Donald Trump in Linden, Washington in May of 2016. Activists Josefina Mora and Thomas Kaplan have been sentenced to 10 days of labor on a jail's work crew after a judge threw out their necessity defense, in which they were arguing the civil disobedience was necessary to prevent the spread of fascism and hate groups, both locally and nationwide. This is Thomas Kaplan and Josefina Mora at the protest back in 2016.
So right now I have my arms in 2 tubes each side, and on my right there's Nia, and she is chained to a ladder, and on my left there's Thomas, and he's also chained to a ladder.
It's a community where white supremacy has been rampant since it's been colonized, and we're particularly drawing attention to Linden because here has been the center of Ku Klux Klan rallies and organizing for at least 100 years, and right now it's a hotbed for racism against farm workers. We're not going to allow Donald Trump to come to our community and spread hate and try to encourage the detention or the terrorism towards people of color and undocumented persons.
Okay, so we can understand something about the significance of the immigrant question. But what we have learned in this course is that the U.S. federal government supports both corporate and business needs for inexpensive workers and high profits, and hence a nation by design. Since its inception, the United States has maintained groups of rightless workers. The United States practices exclusionary citizenship. And again, it began with indentured servant, then it moved to slavery. It's now called undocumented immigration. It is a contracted form of labor. And we have witnessed disenfranchisement and dispossession of the immigrant worker sprinkled with white racism. Again, the fear of the other, the fear of the immigrant translates into policy that prevents people from achieving social justice and equality. So Trump's election represents the Republicans' commitment to white racial power. It started with Nixon's Southern strategy. It gained fruition with Reaganomics and Papa Bush's 1,000 points of light. And it permanently ensconced itself in the guise of son of a Bush's terrorism doctrine. This commitment to white racial power is what got Trump elected. When looking at the recent demonstrations of this white superiority fantasy, the people participating are not the common poor white trash stereotypes of thugs with tattoos, though they are there posing as militant buffoons, but middle-class professionals working in offices and in higher education and living as your next-door neighbors. When Barack Obama was elected, the reactionaries began recruiting heavily under the Tea Party label. Now under Trump, they have blatantly come out with coveting white power, white privilege. The religious right, meanwhile, underscores white supremacy. Evangelicals and fundamentalists praise God or give praise to God for bringing Trump to power. There is a long history of racism and anti-Semitism in the United States. Today, the alt-right is well armed with automatic rifles. And this is what the Republicans let loose from their closet when they gave Trump the executive suite. So it will be interesting to see how they try to control this idiot that they granted power to. Now, throughout the immigrant experience, we have seen how workers gain respect with employment. Everyone is committed to work when decently employed. Immigrant workers throughout history are following the logic of where wealth can be redistributed. Unions have always asked for decency in meeting subsistence needs. Every immigrant community that is now part of the American social fabric developed strategies to improve the immigrant community's struggle to survive. A sense of awareness and a commitment to immigrant rights and responsibilities have always been a part of the naturalization process. So last week, we understood that between 1870 and 1920, the industrial and the political elites of both Mexico and the United States would take hold of their respective countries and organize the greatest march of economic growth in human history. They would do it with the aid of and at the expense of every conceivable labor force: black labor, white labor, Chinese labor, Asian labor, European immigrant labor, Mexican labor, Native American labor, female labor, child labor, and they would reward them differently by their race, by their gender, by their national origin, by their age, and by their social class. And this march of economic growth transformed existing social relations and introduced radical changes in production and occupational structures. And the main areas of occupation for those living in and moving to northern Mexico and to the United States Southwest, the main areas of occupation were cattle ranching, agriculture, mining, and transportation. Now, the Porfiriato in Mexico was violent. The advance of civilization through modernization, through the rise of urban centers, through immigration, through the rapid industrialization of the country, it came at the expense of the working class. It came at the expense of farmers and peasants. So wealth, political power, and access to education were concentrated amongst the few, both in the United States as well as Mexico. So overwhelmingly, people of European descent controlled both wealth and governmental decision-making power in Mexico. Foreign companies linked through Wall Street and headquartered in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Austin, London, Paris, and Amsterdam exercised power in Mexico. Now, the source of the wealth generated at the turn of the century that was used for the financing of mass consumption, the source of wealth generated at the turn of the century that was used for the financing of mass production was mining. Mexico, with financial backing from Wall Street, tapped into its mineral wealth. The United States, meanwhile, developed the mineral wealth that once belonged to her neighbor to the south. So it is in this vein that we need to appreciate those miners who were working and generating this wealth. In Mexico, they were known as los mineros. Now, Arizona and New Mexico teemed with activity along with the northern border states of Chihuahua and Sonora. Mexicans filled the labor needs for this exploding industry. We're going to take a look at a film clip from a documentary called Los Mineros. This is a PBS documentary, and we want to get a glimpse at the process of change that occurred in Arizona at the turn of the century. We're going to watch a clip from a PBS documentary entitled Los Mineros, which is a film that is required viewing for this class. Now let's visit a place called Clifton Morenci in Arizona, and let's appreciate how racism is an instrument of power used by those in power to perpetuate their power. Let's also appreciate the rich racist legacy of Arizona and recognize that the current crisis in Arizona, especially over SB 1070 and the recent controversy over Sheriff Joe Arpaio, is but a continuous expression of a deep-rooted hatred that whites have exhibited toward Mexicans in the state of Arizona. Let's go to that film clip.
Clifton Morenci, Arizona. There is little left to remind us of the fortunes that were made and lost in these hills. Copper made this one of the richest mining districts in the United States. Thousands of Mexican workers came here. They were promised jobs and good wages. Among the first to arrive was the father of David Velasquez. He left Mexico with a few bags and a contractor's words of great opportunity still echoing in his head.
My father came over to Morenci in about 1906, and he used to live in Chihuahua. Apparently the American companies knew that the people from Chihuahua were experienced miners, So they used to send their people out there and recruit. And they come over what they used to call reenganches. In other words, they recruit a bunch of people, men especially, and bring them over all together.
Most of the mineros came from the northern Mexican states of Sonora and Chihuahua, where they had been miners for generations. They were brought to a small mining district in eastern Arizona. Within a few years, Clifton Morenci grew from 200 to 10,000. The mining boom was sparked by America's enormous appetite for copper. With the arrival of electricity, copper was needed for telephone lines, telegraph service, and power plants. Newcomers from all over came to work in Morenci. They shared one thing in common: the business of getting copper out of the ground. Using candles for light, the miners spent 12 hours a day underground. They worked 4,000 feet below the surface in a maze of tunnels 100 miles long. The shafts were supported only by wooden beams.
You can always hear the timber creaking, like in an old house. Of course, the first thing you did when you went into your working place was look for loose boulders, loose rocks. And you put in timbers for as much room as you had. And you'd start drilling and just hope nothing fell on you.
Work areas were cramped. The air was thin. Temperatures would rise to 104 degrees. As experienced miners, the mineros were accustomed to harsh conditions underground. What they weren't prepared for was the way they were treated simply because they were Mexican. Sylvester Maury, an early traveler to Arizona, wrote,
"My own experience has taught me that the lower class of Mexicans are docile, faithful, good servants. They have been peons for generations. It is their natural condition."
Mexicans were assigned the worst jobs in the mines, and the most dangerous. Anglo timbermen who built the wooden supports were paid $4 a day. Mexican timbermen received $2. Anglo muckers who shoveled the ore out of the mines were paid $1.50 a day. Mexican muckers were paid 70 cents. This dual-wage system persisted throughout the mining industry.
Nos trajeron porque podemos trabajar.
They brought us for our skills, and now they treat us worse than dogs.
Que no somos como ellos.
Because we are not like them, they forget we are men.
In those days, a lot of them suffered. They were the burros, the ones that did all the work in those mines. See what I mean? Those were the guys that producing and dying in there.
The minero not only faced hardship in the mines, but also in town, a company town, built chiefly by the Phelps Dodge Corporation. Like all such towns, the company owned and operated everything, from the waterworks to the hospital to the workers' homes. Miners bought their food and dry goods at the Phelps Dodge Mercantile Store, where markups of 200% were common. With a day's salary, a miner could only buy a dozen eggs and a pound of coffee.
It was hard on my father because he didn't know how to speak English. He didn't know how to add or subtract. I saw receipts from the grocery store where they would add them up. They didn't have an adding machine at that time. They add them up by hand. 6 and 6, 15. 1 and carry the 5. Always to the store advantage.
The Morenci Club was where company officials and their families spent their free time. Here they could play billiards, tennis, and bridge. The club was off limits to Mexicans, as were all Anglo establishments. Socializing between Anglos and Mexicans was strictly forbidden.
This one morning when I went to work, told me the mine superintendent wanted to see me. So I went over and he said, Avery, you had so-and-so up at your house last night. And I said, yeah. He said, you don't have Mexicans come to your house. And I said, well, goddamn, it's my house. I'll have anybody come to it I want. He said, no, if you won't. He said, that's a company house. And he said, you work for the company. Remember that.
Mexicans were forced to live in the most undesirable parts of town, usually along steep hillsides. In Morenci, the Mexican side of town was called Chihuahua Hill. Unlike Anglo neighborhood.
Now, I do believe that that film clip was cut a little bit short, but wanted to share with you again the racialization process. We need to appreciate how racism is an instrument of power used by those in power to perpetuate their power. And of course, this is the rich racist legacy of Arizona. What is important to appreciate is the four-part process that the community faced: racism and discrimination, educational deprivation, political disfranchisement, and economic marginality through a dual wage system. Yet Mexican labor was needed. So let's appreciate socialism and labor organizing. Let's understand labor organizing in the socialist tradition in both Mexico and the United States between 1880 to 1920. In this 40-year period, there were movements for change that reflected a people's commitment to constructing a just society. They are the reason why we must pay attention to social change and the development of consciousness. There is a strong socialist tradition in both countries. People understood that socialism is a process of ideas whereby people arrange, design, and construct a just society. And the central goal of socialism is humankind. People undergoing populism and progressive reform in the United States through farmers' associations, labor organizations, women's rights movements, and people undergoing revolution in Mexico to radically reconstruct a constitution that gave meaningful voice to the equal distribution of the wealth and the end to racial and gender discrimination. Well, these peoples in both countries placed at their respective movements' center the concept of direct participatory mass democracy, an involvement by everyone in the decisions that direct the social order. People called not just for political democracy, the right to vote, but also economic democracy, the right to a living wage, to social equality, the right to be free in your expression of culture, and an end to racial and gender discrimination. Let's return to the documentary on Los Mineros, and let's witness how Mexicans formed mutual aid societies and attempted to be recognized as unions in an effort to end the dual wage system. We're going to take a look at a 1903 strike at Clifton Morenci, and we will listen to how white miners will use the racialization process and to disdain their Mexican counterparts. Let's go to back to the film clip.
A sense of community developed in Chihuahuita. Shut out by the Anglos, the Mineros started societies of their own, called mutualistas, or mutual aid societies.
Mutualistas were very important for Mexicans to combat racism. The Alianza Hispanoamericana, or La Liga Protectora, made it very clear that they were there to protect the rights of Mexicans, to speak out for the Mexican, to help him in any way that they could.
The mutualistas offered burial insurance and sponsored social events, and increasingly tried to deal with a hostile Anglo world. A report from the Department of Interior in 1908 stated,
"The Mexican laborer is unambitious, listless, physically weak, irregular, and indolent. His strongest point is his willingness to work for low wages."
As the mine owners aggressively recruited Mexican labor, Anglo workers were terrified their own jobs were in jeopardy because Mexicans worked for so little. the Anglos turned to a union, the Western Federation of Miners. The WFM decided the best way to protect Anglos was to drive the Mexicans out of the mines. The anti-Mexican campaign began with a devious plan. Anglos were paid by the day, the Mexicans by the hour. The union forced the copper companies to cut the workday from 10 hours to 8 hours. Overnight, the Mineros suffered a 20% cut in pay. On the morning of June 3, 1903, for the first time in Arizona history, over 1,000 Mexican workers went out on strike. The mining companies refused to negotiate. Abraham Salcido, a 26-year-old minero from Chihuahua, led the strike against the company, becoming a folk hero in the process.
Estos versos que yo canto se convierten en corrido.
The verses that I sing is a corrido to remember a hero whose name is Abraham Salcido.
Abraham Salcido vino a Clifton, Arizona.
He came to Clifton, Arizona
Ayudarle a sus paisanos
to help his countrymen earn an equal wage like the Americans.
sueldo como los americanos.
The Mineros armed themselves and took control of the mines, shutting down the smelters and mills. The governor asked the Mexican consul to come talk some sense to the Mexicans and ordered 300 Arizona Rangers to the scene. "2,000 miners marched in solidarity through the town, openly taunting the Rangers. The governor cabled President Roosevelt asking for cavalry support.
Comenzaron la discordia, les llegó una tempestad.
At the height of the tension, a heavy thunderstorm broke. A massive flood swept over the city.
La ciudad.
When the flood hit the Mexican side of town, 50 people were killed instantly. Most of their homes were destroyed. The next day, federal troops disarmed the strikers and placed the community under martial law. Ten of the strike leaders were arrested, including Abraham Salcido. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison for inciting a riot. Within 2 weeks, the strikers were back at work. The strike had failed. The dual wage system was still in place. The Mineros had lost the opening skirmish, but the battle was far from over.
Every day, people was getting hurt underground mining. A lot of times, people will blow up working with the dynamite. And sometimes, the tunnels where they're working will cave in. Almost every day, they used to bring out somebody with a broken leg, broken arm, broken something, neck or something like that. Every day used to happen that.
A lot of them got cut by those motor cars they had in there that pulled those little old cars. Sometimes it was pretty dark in there, you know, with the dust and fumes in there, and these guys couldn't see those motor cars coming, and I saw a lot of them die.
There was not too much protection for the workers. They did most of the drilling dry. They didn't have respirators. The only thing they could do was cover their face with a handkerchief.
Among the worst threats miners faced was silicosis, known as miner's consumption. 1 out of every 3 miners got this deadly lung condition from years of breathing the mineral dust.
My father, after putting about 22 years underground, he could barely breathe.
He coughs day and night because his lungs are full of that dust, you know. Can't get it out of there no more. They cough day and night, and every time they cough, they throw out small pieces of lungs until their lungs disappear and they die. It's painful.
I remember when my father died, we took him by a horse buggy from here down to the depot. Any worker that died, that worked for the company at that time, the company would furnish their train. They would take him by train to the cemetery. They used to call it a Catholic cemetery because all the Chicanos were Catholics. They wouldn't want to call it the Mexican cemetery, so they just call it the Catholic cemetery.
Again, what's nice about this film is that it's really underscoring the racialization process, a process that I asked you to remember throughout the course. And now we're seeing the visual experience of a community that had to deal with racism. Now let's go south into Mexico, because just south of Clifton Morenci, there occurred a major battle involving a transnational corporation practicing a dual wage system. Only this time, the dual wage system favored American immigrant workers over Mexican citizens. In an isolated spot bordering southeastern Arizona and northeastern Sonora, during June of 1906, a strike is going to take place in the Mexican mining town of Cananea, Sonora. And since the late 19th century, the Nogales-based Cananea Consolidated Copper Company paid over 5,000 Mexican workers half the wages per day that over 2,000 American workers there were earning for the same job. So conditions in which the Mexican employees worked were deplorable. They likewise faced the racialization process, but this time in their home country. And during the celebration of Cinco de Mayo, the Mexican employees made public their complaints while the local authority applied martial law to avoid further conflicts. So striking workers in Cananea confronted U.S. soldiers protecting the company store. So we're going to return to the documentary in Los Mineros. We're going to witness an effort to end the dual wage system in Cananea, Mexico, under the Porfirio Diaz regime. Now let's appreciate this one man that was part of, instrumental in the 1903 Clifton Morenci strike. His name is Abram Salcido. You might remember him because there was a song attributed to him. Now, one of the reasons Mexicans sing corridos is to honor those who help us remember moments of resistance against oppression. Corridos retell the story of what was once lived in the Mexican experience. Corridos are like ballads. They're working class historical memoirs. Remember, the Mexican community did not have a middle class in the United States, an educated class that would write their histories. So the communities remembered their histories through song, hence the corrido. Corridos are popular cultural expressions recounting struggles to achieve justice against institutionalized racism. How else can one make sense of the Cananea strike in 1906 if it isn't the corrido of Abram Salcido? Now, one of the things that's important is after 3 years in an Arizona prison for the Clifton Morenci strike of 1903, Abram Salcido will move directly down to I'm sorry, I just drew a blank, to the Cananea, and he will found the organizational struggle of Mexican workers in what will be known as the 1906 Cananea strike. Okay, let's go to the film clip.
40 miles south of the U.S. border was a mining empire in Cananea, Mexico. An American, Colonel William Greene, owned the Cananea Copper Company. Mexican President Porfirio Diaz had enticed foreign industrialists to take advantage of Mexico's rich natural resources. By 1906, Cananea looked more like a company town in Arizona than a Mexican pueblo. The town's most prominent structure was not the Catholic Church, but Colonel Greene's two-story clapboard mansion. The Mineros suffered the same conditions as their countrymen north of the border. They endured segregated housing, lack of promotion, and even in Mexico, a dual-wage system.
The Americans were paid the number three in dollars, and the Mexicans were paid 3 pesos. The rate of exchange was 2 to 1, so automatically Americans for the same type of work got paid twice as much.
Outraged by this oppressive treatment of their fellow countrymen, Mexican intellectuals and political activists began to organize. Cananea became a symbol of foreign tyranny.
Señores mineros, teach the American you are not beasts of burden. The American who has displaced us with his legion of blue-eyed blondes, Esteban Calderon.
My father was a baker, and he owned a bakery there in Cananea. But yet he was one of those liberal types, and I guess he liked to play politics. He would sympathize with the miners or the conditions that they were subject. So over here, there was a little place called Ori Plata, where they used to plan their tragedies.
Abraham Salcido was released from prison in Arizona in the spring of 1906. He went directly to Cananea to join the labor organizers working in the mines. On June 2nd, that same year, the Mineros went out on strike. They gathered to present their demands to company officials.
Colonel Greene personally came out and talked to the miners and told them that he wanted to raise their salaries, but that the President of Mexico wouldn't allow it, that he was asking them as a friend to go back to work.
The strikers refused. Dressed in their Sunday best, they marched through the camp to gather supporters. Over 2,500 arrived at the company's lumber yard, run by 2 Americans, George and Will Metcalf. George had been warned the strikers were coming.
The first thing that the 2 Metcalf brothers did inside of the lumberyard was to turn on the hoses that they had in case of a fire, and they trained it on the crowd. This infuriated the miners, so they forced the doors open. The 2 Metcalf brothers shot, apparently first into the air and then directly into the crowd, killing 2 or 3 of the miners. The miners set fire to the office of the lumberyard to smoke the 2 Metcalf brothers out. They came out still shooting, and the miners killed them both. One of them was apparently killed with his own rifle, and the other one was clubbed to death and stuck to death with miners' candlesticks that they were still carrying during the march that they had. Once they had killed the 2 Metcalf brothers, the miners were met by a group of about 30 armed Americans headed by Greene, and the shooting began again.
By 4 o'clock that afternoon, Mexican troops arrived to put down the strike. They were joined by 270 Arizona Rangers who had been armed at the Phelps Dodge Mercantile store. The Rangers had violated Mexican law in crossing the border with arms. To avoid an international incident, they were hastily deputized by the Mexican state governor. By the next day, the strike had been put down. Once again, Abraham Salcido and the other strike leaders were jailed for inciting a riot.
My father was arrested and sent to prison. They never could prove anything. So he came to the United States and he says, I've had enough of that thing in Mexico.
23 people lost their lives at Cananea, 17 of them Mexican. The strike had failed. None of the strikers' demands was met. But the Cananea strike would give birth to the first major revolution of the 20th century, the Mexican Revolution. In the end, Porfirio Diaz would be in exile, and 1 million of his countrymen would lay dead. The violence of the Mexican Revolution would have a lasting impact on the border region. Volatile racial tensions were inflamed. Arizonans feared the bloodshed would spill over the border.
Okay, so here we understand this particular commitment to justice, not only to political democracy, but also economic democracy and social equality. Abraham Salcido was a socialist organizer. He challenged truth to power. He put his life on the line for something larger than himself. Now, although the workers were forced to return to their positions with no demands being met, the action was a key event in the general unrest that emerged during the final years of the regime of Porfirio Diaz and that prefigured the Mexican Revolution of 1910. So kind of, figure this out. Again, the racism of Arizona as expressed by those armed rangers. They crossed the border into Mexico to attack Mexicans. Now, go figure that. Go figure how the Mexican government is going to deputize them. Now, if you can, then you're going to begin to recognize something about the chaos that led to the Mexican Revolution. Now, the Mexican Revolution is important to appreciate because the Mexican Revolution, again, the Porfiriato was violent. Overwhelmingly, people of European descent controlled both wealth and governmental decision-making power. Foreign companies linked through Wall Street exercised power in Mexico. So when we take a look at the Mexican Revolution, it has many characters and movements for change. And nearly every Mexican family living in the United States has a personal story about relatives and their experiences in the revolution. And the ultimate cost of the revolution was a loss in lives. Contemporary historians approximate that 2.1 million people died between 1910 and 1920. Just 100 years after Hidalgo's September 16th Grito de Dolores, the carnage began when Francisco Madero declared the Diaz regime illegal on November 20th, 1910. So in the Mexican Revolution, nearly every racial and class interest participated in revolutionary struggle to create a just society. Let's take a look at what happened in the Mexican Revolution.
My father grew up in this little village in the mountains of Jalisco, in the middle of Mexico. And he said they had chickens and goats and dirt floors, and they had horses and cattle.
Then in 1914, war came to Altos de Jalisco. And just like that, everything was gone.
All his brothers and sisters were slaughtered. All that was left was this 11-year-old kid and one sister that was 13 and another sister that her husband had been killed at the dinner table. And my father said that when his father came back from Santa Monica, California, where he'd gone for a year to work on a horse ranch, he saw all the cattle had been stolen, all the horses had been taken. Almost all his sons had been killed. And he started screaming, "It's the end of the world. God has forsaken us." And he started drinking and died. On the other hand, mi chaparrita, my grandmother from Oaxaca, she saw the same circumstances and she didn't fall apart. She said, mañana es otro milagro de Dios. Tomorrow's another miracle from God. Y con el favor de Dios, and with the blessing of God, we will survive. And they left the mountains of Jalisco.
The family headed down to León, to the valley of Guanajuato. Like hundreds of thousands of other Mexicans, they went in search of a train that would take them north, away from the war that now consumed Mexico. The Mexican Revolution began in 1910 as a revolt against President Porfirio Díaz. Díaz ruled Mexico for 35 years, relying on foreign investment to transform the nation.
He attracted considerable foreign investment from Europe and from the United States.
U.S. companies invested nearly $2 billion in Mexico, in mining, commercial agriculture, and in the railroads that carried silver, coffee, and oil north, and brought south the machinery that built modern Mexico.
Porfirio Díaz is credited with the modernization of Mexico, but at what cost? There is rising poverty. Historians estimate that 90% of Mexicans were landless. Rural people were kicked off their small land holdings to make way for this concentration of corporate agriculture.
Porfirio Díaz had promised to step down. But in 1910, he declared himself president for one more term. His opponent, Francisco Madero, called for an insurrection. In the south rose Emiliano Zapata and his army of landless peasants. In the north, the dashing Pancho Villa became the face of the rebellion. The trains that once linked the Mexican economy to the United States now carry the armies of the Mexican Revolution. And as the fighting engulfed Mexico, the tracks running north provided the only means of escape for almost 1 million Mexicans, who walked for miles, sometimes waiting weeks for the occasional empty train.
From 1/10 to 1/8 of Mexico's population, an estimated 1 million, perished in the revolution. About the same number went north.
The Villaseñors made their way toward the United States and headed right into the worst of the fighting.
Fighting was going on all around me. And my father said that even after a day of slaughter, his mother would have them all kneel down and thank God they had survived. And if they didn't have anything to eat, she'd get little round river rocks and have them suck on them. When the moon came up in the Mexican Indian culture, that's the left eye of God. And then the stars are our family because we come from the stars. And she'd point to the stars and say, that's, your great-grandfather this, and this is your uncle this and this. My father said that if it wasn't for his mother's indestructible faith, they would have died over and over and over on their journey north.
Midway between the mountains of central Mexico and the border of the United States, Juan Salvador no longer yearned for the life he'd known in Altos de Jalisco.
My father thought that the United States would be like paradise. Like their little paradise that they'd had in the mountains of Jalisco was nothing compared to the paradise of the United States. And they understood that once you crossed the Rio Grande River in Texas, that there was food for everyone and there was jobs for everyone, and that the people actually got fat. He couldn't imagine such a thing.
Finally, one day a train came, a cattle train, filled with manure, but also filled with possibilities.
When my father and his family finally got to the American border, crossed the Rio Grande from El Paso, Texas, it wasn't anything like they expected. There was nothing, just sand. And there were thousands of people trying to get across.
El Paso.
Okay, so despite the chaos, people tolerated their experiences. And we're going to go back to the Arizona community so that we can understand something with regards to them and facing the racialization process, because again, acute disillusionment can rob life of its meaning, so you have to find something from within by which to uplift you. So people tolerated their experiences by celebrating their identity through culturally based music, dance, and food preparation. Let's go back to the Minero struggle and let's appreciate their celebrations.
To survive in this hostile environment, the Mineros turned inward, looking to each other for help and support. Strong ties of language and culture kept them united. On Mexican holidays, everyone in Chihuahuita turned out to celebrate.
They used to have a town band, and they used to have concerts at the plaza, had a little kiosco, a gazebo, I think they call it. And it was something like a family day. The big fiesta was on 16th of September, Cinco de Mayo. They used to have games and contests and races and boxing matches. They used to have what they called charrascas, which was house parties. They had a regular orchestra, violin, guitar, and maybe a bass.
We used to have good orchestra.
Very good music. Besos y cerezas. You never heard that, did you?
I had to bake 2 pies or 3 pies every Saturday, or 2-3 cakes every Saturday, so I could go to the dance.
And of course, they always had a tub full of ice and beer. It used to be homebrew. The kids used to go there and stand out on the porch and look inside, look at the grown-ups dancing and kicking up quite a storm.
They were really
Yeah,
dancing.
but
We
when
wear
you're
long
talking-
dresses.
what you're talking about
long
is-
dresses.
Ooh, we used to dance the floor with that one. Ooh.
All right, so we can appreciate how Mexicans adjusted to the racialization process because they would organize community celebrations respecting their heritage. Music, dance, food were created for their delight. But then struggles appeared. And we're going to learn about a very important deportation. And again, we're going to appreciate something about the process of change, and we're going to emphasize later on, but this is known as the Bisbee deportation. Now again, there's the great socialist tradition of the European immigrant worker. There's the socialist tradition of the Mexican worker. So let's appreciate how the tradition of the socialist tradition is going to find fruition in the organizing efforts of one of the most important labor unions of the early 20th century. And that labor union was known as the Industrial Workers of the World, or the IWW, or the Wobblies. We're going to visit a place called Bisbee, Arizona, and we're going to understand what happened when white workers attempted to unite with Mexican workers during World War I with the hope of creating racial equality, with the hope of eliminating the dual wage system. Let's appreciate what came to be known as the Bisbee deportation. And let's not be surprised at what Arizona and this Trump administration is attempting to do today. Let's go back to Los Mineros.
By 1915, a new union had entered Arizona. The International Workers of the World, better known as the Wobblies, were motivated by socialist ideals and dedicated to the overthrow of capitalism.
The IWW was looked upon as being a radical movement made up of unpatriotic Americans who were suspect of having communistic tendencies. The IWW wanted to represent the working class. The IWW wanted to represent the immigrant. And the IWW especially wanted to represent the Mexican immigrant.
The demand was that everyone be treated equally on the job. The men of the union were demanding that they be recognized and there be no discrimination against anyone because of race, religion, or national origin.
World War I brought the Mineros, the Wobblies, and the mining companies into a sharp confrontation. With the country at war, the demand for copper rose astronomically. In 2 years, the price of copper had jumped from 13 cents to 27 cents a pound. By 1917, Phelps Dodge reported a 218% increase in net profits. The workers saw none of this in their paychecks. On June 27, 1917, in nearby Bisbee, 4,000 workers demanded higher wages and an end to the dual-wage system. Boasted by the support of large numbers of Mineros, the Wobblies called a strike, war or no war. Walter Douglas, president of Phelps Dodge, had no patience for the demands.
Those who are not for us are against us. The strikers are getting further and further outside the citizens of this country who place devotion to flag above every other consideration. An infected sore may well become a cancer if it is not cut out. Walter Douglas.
Phelps Dodge quickly retaliated.
They put the story out that the miners tunneled underground, that they were German spies, and they were going to blow up the Bisbee post office. The mining company took over the telephone company, the Western Union. They put guards on all incoming and outgoing traffic. You could not come into Bisbee and you could not get word out without mining company permission.
Early on the morning of July 12, 1917, vigilantes armed by Phelps Dodge arrested 2,000 strikers. At gunpoint, the prisoners were marched into the downtown plaza. Those who pledged loyalty to the company were released. Everyone else was marched to the edge of town.
My father was operating a jitney service. That was a long-distance taxi and a local taxi, too. His customers, I assume, would have been mostly the miners. When they started running the people out of town, they came and got him early in the morning.
"1,200 prisoners were loaded into cattle cars of the El Paso and Southwestern Railroad, owned by Phelps Dodge. Packed 50 to a car, they were taken 200 miles to Columbus, New Mexico. They were dumped in the desert with no food or water and threatened with death if they returned to Bisbee. Phelps Dodge announced, "Any talk of their coming back is nonsense. They will not be allowed to come back. The serious business of this district is the mining of copper ore, not the building of nightly schools of anarchism." A year later, a commission appointed by President Woodrow Wilson condemned the Bisbee deportation as it came to be known. It was called a grave violation of the law and the Constitution. Unions would not return to Arizona for 25 years.
Well, all you got to do is get the public stirred up, and freedom is out the window. What is it? Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. And if you're not eternally vigilant, you're going to lose your liberty. And the Mexicans didn't have any to begin with, and the rest of them didn't have much more, as a matter of fact.
Phelps Dodge was growing increasingly powerful. The company bought all of Arizona's leading newspapers. Telephone and telegraph systems were company-controlled. Even town attitudes were dominated by the company.
A lot of the Anglos that were in high position would take advantage of a lot of the Chicanos. My point in the...
What I need from you, Yukiri, is to go back right before that end, because I am going to come back to that later on in the clip on repatriation. So we need to make sure that we come back to that. If you could come back just a little bit on that, I appreciate it. Now, the Bisbee deportation shares with us something about civil liberties being eliminated for war profiteering. When we take a look at that labor lawyer, John Pintek, it is because of his work that we understand something about the Bisbee deportation. It is through his efforts that we have come to understand, historians have come to understand something more about what happened at the Bisbee deportation. And of course, his words are very, very important, students. Get the public stirred up and freedom is out the window. Get the public stirred up and freedom is out the window. How many times have we experienced that in this, since 9/11? Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. John Pintek was talking about eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. If you're not eternally vigilant, you will lose your liberty. And the Mexicans didn't have any, and the rest not much more. But eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. That's a quote from Thomas Jefferson. So at gunpoint, Mexicans are going to be sent across the border at Columbus. Now, it's going to take a while for those white workers to be sent back to their original homes, which is back in the east in the Appalachian Mountains and New England area, the states where they originated from. They're going to be left out in the desert likewise. But African-American soldiers that are known as Buffalo Soldiers, they were stationed in Fort Bliss in El Paso, Texas. Those Buffalo Soldiers are going to be recruited to build a tent city for the white workers that were dumped in the desert along with the Mexicans. And these African-American soldiers are going to provide for them housing as well as cook for them while they're being processed and sent back east where they're from, Kentucky, Tennessee, the Appalachian Mountains. So this is an amazing story, straight out from the Arizona's racist legacy. Again, we should not be surprised. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to visit or revisit the National Origins Act of 1924. Now, why is this act so controversial? Again, have you noticed that I've been talking about Native American, the red beans, European, the white beans, African American, the black beans, Asian American, the yellow beans, and then now Mexican, the brown beans. And I've been ending with 1924 in this National Origins Act. And one of the reasons why this is the most controversial act concerning immigration, because it passed both houses of Congress, and it took a long time to come together, this act. It started in 1907, and finally by 1924, the act comes to fruition. But basically, both houses of Congress are reacting to the turbulent white migration of populations to the United States. And so you have to remember, students, that when I talked about aliens, the term aliens, it referred to Europeans at first. then it's going to be applied to Asians and Mexicans. But the National Origins Act of 1924 was influenced into law by the radicalism of white workers who wanted justice. And that's why the Bisbee deportation, the industrial workers of the world, these white workers, they weren't tolerated. They wanted justice for Mexicans too. That's not right. The United States won't tolerate workers like that. When the 1920s began, the US government made sure that the industrial workers of the world was destroyed, that all radical immigrants were deported, and that the main leader of the Socialist Party, Eugene Debs, was in jail. So in the 1920s, during and after World War I, strikes by workers are beaten down by force. Congress in the 20s is going to put an end to the dangerous and turbulent flood of immigrants by passing laws setting immigration quotas. Now, the quotas favored Anglo-Saxons. It kept out Africans, it kept out Asians, it limited the arrival of Southern and Eastern Europeans, and it limited the arrival of people from Czechoslovakia or Slavic peoples, the Slavs. It limited the arrival of Jews. English, Protestant, Irish, and German were favored over African, Chinese, and Eastern and Southern Europeans. Now, the National Origins Act is important because it solidified the melting pot theory for white Americans. And please understand the melting pot, it's for white Americans. It ensured the three-generational process of change, or known as assimilation, as defined in earlier presentations, that this assimilation became a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant privilege. Yes, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant privilege. That's what the National Origins Act of 1924 is all about. WASPs only apply. Now, at the same time, the KKK is going to be revived in the 1920s, and it's spread into the North. By 1924, the KKK is going to boast 4.5 million members. So the warning sign to immigrants coming to America became cemented in the decade that was known as the Roaring Twenties, the Jazz Age. WASPs only apply. Only WASPs apply. Now, you have to understand that the Jazz Age, that the African tradition is going to be imprinted in the Jazz Age because white Americans are going to try to finally wake up and realize, hey, they really like jazz. And so they'll expropriate that music from the black community and make it theirs. But guess what? The National Origins Act did not include Mexicans. Isn't that great? It did not include Mexicans. Well, why? Because there were significant and powerful industrial and agricultural lobbyists who made sure that Mexicans could enter any time. The compromise was in this bill was that that Mexicans would have to pay a head tax to enter, thereby financing the creation of what will become known as the Border Patrol. Mexicans were wanted. Mexicans were recruited to build the infrastructure of the Southwest. There was transportation, there was mining, there was agriculture, irrigation projects. Irrigation, all of these needed Mexican labor forces. So the United States corporations had optimized their power in Congress in the 1920s. And labor forces are tied to U.S. interests. And so it necessitates movements of populations to the development of the U.S. economy in specific areas. In this place, it's U.S. Southwest and the Midwest. Railroads, agriculture, mining, irrigation projects assured and perpetuated the need for Mexican labor. So students, you are reading a particular chapter by Zaragoza Vargas that helps us understand the need for labor in this era. So let's go to a film clip from Latino Americans and let's appreciate this need for work, or workers.
El Paso was the Ellis Island for Mexicans. If you were a strapping young man and you were coming across that Staten Street Bridge, there would be recruiters from Pennsylvania, from Idaho, from Utah, from Colorado, from California, all over, wanting your labor, bidding for your labor.
It's not just the Mexican Revolution forcing people out. The exodus, if you will, is propelled by the revolution, but it began before that. It has to do with the great labor demand for the booming agricultural economy of the Southwest. This is when the great aqueducts in California are built. This is when the Central Valley towns in California are founded. Same thing is happening in Texas. You have these desert lands being reclaimed and being farmed.
So there was this sort of impetus that there were jobs. But if you're a woman, it's going to be harder for you to get across that border because it was like, well, you know, who's going to support you? Are you liable to become a public charge?
All right, so again, that film clip emphasizes the fact that labor forces are tied to U.S. interests, which necessitates movements of populations for the development, in this particular case of the United States Southwest, and as I shared with you students who will be reading a chapter on the U.S. Midwest, where Mexicanos are going to find themselves going into places like Ypsilanti, Michigan, into Chicago. Mexicans are going to be all over in the developing, again, the economic infrastructure of the U.S. marketing system. So throughout the first 2 decades of the 20th century, Mexicanos, as they come into the United States, are going to move into areas that are predominantly Mexican. They're going to move into areas that are, into regions that are environmentally, geographically, and topographically similar to Mexico. And as they entered, Mexicanos are all going to experience the economic discrimination through a dual wage system, through a dual wage structure. And of course, as their numbers grew, the treatment by the dominant society became heightened and alarmist. And so, of course, hysteria surrounds American communities when numbers of perceived foreigners increase. And the mass media can stir up public opinion, which can influence legislation. So throughout the 1920s, debates are going to occur over what to do with, quote unquote, the Mexican problem. Now, the National Origins Act of 1924 did not include the Mexican in the legislation. Mexican, because of corporate interest, all they had to do now was pay a head tax. So since the 1850s, and increasingly around the turn of the 20th century, urban barrios became important centers of economic activity, of political activity, and cultural activity. And so it becomes important for us to appreciate the creation or the development or an understanding of the Mexican barrio. What's important, as American cities were built around Mexican communities, barrios came into being from San Antonio, Texas, all the way through here in Los Angeles, California, through Denver, Albuquerque, Arizona, Phoenix, Tucson, San Jose, all the way up to San Francisco, San Diego, all the way up to San Francisco. And so what happened is, as American cities are going to be built around the Mexican communities, a social, psychological, and organizational cohesiveness occurred. Mexican immigrants naturally are going to move into the barrios. Mexican immigrants are going to create their own barrios. An example is Watson Compton. They were Mexican railroad camps. So when you go into Watson Compton, the origins of Watson Compton are when the Mexicans had built the railroads connecting to Los Angeles, they were just dumped, and that became their area to survive. During World War I, when we take a look at the great migration of Southern blacks, of the black experience, as the Southern migration occurs, those moving west are going to enter Watson Compton and be living with the Mexican railroad workers. So as railroads, agriculture, and mining interests, along with massive state-sponsored irrigation projects, they assured and perpetuated the need for Mexican labor. Many Mexicans found themselves moving to states like Iowa, Nebraska, Illinois, and Michigan, where they created their own enclaves. So this urban barrio context will be dramatized in the 1920s and 1930s as sociologists became concerned with, quote unquote, the Mexican problem. Let's go to a film clip and appreciate Los Angeles.
1920s Los Angeles was a boom town. Pulled by plentiful work in agriculture, factories, and construction. Mexican immigrants headed to the city in ever-increasing numbers.
In 1900, you had about 3,000 to 5,000 Mexican-American residents. By 1930, you had about 150,000. It's a lot of people.
In the 1800s, Mexicans had built Los Angeles from a mission into the capital of Spanish California. In the 1920s, they would help build it again.
The story of how Mexicans built the city from a rural town to an industrial metropolis is still largely untold. Without the Mexican labor, much of our infrastructure in the city would not exist.
Now immigrants in a land that had once been theirs, Mexicans were viewed as second-class citizens.
A Mexican presents a new problem. He's not black and he's not white. How do we fit this new race into the American system of stratification? That is resolved by just simply extending the practices of segregation that had been developed for African Americans to Mexican Americans.
There were segregated schools. There could be segregated public facilities. For example, the day before they drained the pool, they had International Day, where anyone who wasn't white could go and use the pool.
Most immigrants gravitated toward downtown and settled around La Plaza de Nuestra Reina de Los Angeles. Founded in 1781, the plaza had once been the center of Mexican life in Southern California.
The plaza was a safe place, it was a romantic place, and it was also a memory of their culture.
For the immigrant generation that comes, the sense that the land was once held by a Spanish elite, a Mexican elite, is incredibly important in making people feel that there is a history here that belongs to them.
Both my parents had a sense of history and remembered the place names of Los Angeles. They always told me that you know, that is Sepulveda, that street, that's Pico. My father even pointed out the 3-story Pico house, which at the time was the most elegant, fancy hotel. And my father whispered in my ear and told me, "Mijo, he was one of us. Pio Pico was one of us."
In the 1920s, fueled by a growing Mexican population, Mexican culture was experiencing a revival.
There's a growth of arts. There's the beginnings of the first ever real Mexican-American music culture. It's recording the music of the Mexican Revolution in Los Angeles. It's exporting it down to Mexico. It's a cultural renaissance in a way that one wouldn't see again until the 1960s.
We see restaurants, bakeries, pharmacies, live theaters. Not to forget the Hollywood movie industry as well. I mean, we can have people like a young Ramon Navarro, who starred in the first silent Ben-Hur, was a Mexican immigrant working as a laborer in downtown Los Angeles.
In the era of the silent film, Mexicans became icons of popular culture. A working-class girl, Lupe Velez, and the aristocratic Dolores del Rio offered two contrasting images for Mexican women coming of age.
Dolores del Rio was discovered in an afternoon tea in Mexico City. She was a wealthy young newlywed. She does not speak English. If you look at her early stills, she looks like a very beautiful but stereotypical Latin American beauty. The hair's done up behind. She's in this rebozo, and she's got this sort of submissive look. Within a few years, when she's an established celebrity, she really sheds the, quote, ethnic imagery. She was able to craft this symbol of the woman on the pedestal, a high-born, sort of Castilian beauty.
I think her beauty is incredibly important For a lot of young Mexican women, she's the inspiration to bring cosmetics into the household. She creates an alternative identity, a new 1920s woman in a Mexican style.
They're bobbing their hair, they're wearing short dresses or they're wearing bloomers, ditching their chaperone and going to the dance hall, the movies.
They're saying, no, wait a second, we're not part of the past of Los Angeles. We're actually part of the future. We're not simply relics from a different era.
Young Mexicans began to build families and moved east, across the Los Angeles River, to Brooklyn Heights, Belvedere, and Boyle Heights, a diverse community in the mountains of East LA. It was there that Natividad Castañeda, a stonemason who had emigrated from Mexico in 1915, settled with his wife Gregoria and their 2 children, Francisco and his younger sister Emilia, born in Los Angeles in 1926.
It was a happy life that I had when I was a little girl. I used to like to go to school. We used to have some time to play before school started, before we went to do our Pledge of Allegiance. We went to the movies here and there. It used to be a nickel to go to the movies. We used to have a Victrola. I remember one of the records that they used to play. It was a song about Soy virgencita, entre las flores me encontrarás. We had a nice summer porch. We had an avocado in the back. My mother used to love avocados. Maybe my dad planted the avocado for her.
Okay, so let's appreciate something that, students, what we can understand with regards to, again, the urban barrios. Urban barrios became important centers of economic, political, and cultural activity. And as American cities are going to be built around the Mexican communities, a social and psychological and organizational cohesiveness is going to occur. And so Mexican immigrants are naturally going to move into the barrios and create their own barrios. So what's going to happen in the 1920s is like what's happening today, is that there's going to be an increasing debate over what to do with the Mexican experience, what to do with the Mexican. And so when we take a look at the national legislation of the 1920s and 1930s, it reflected a tug of war between corporations needing labor forces and then restrictionists, right-wing evangelical bigots and racists known as eugenicists who were calling for deportation. And so this is what led to the creation of the Border Patrol under the immigration quotas restriction legislation of 1924. Mexicans were not included in the act, but now they had to pay a head tax to enter. So throughout the 1920s, these scientific racists known as eugenicists kept lobbying Congress to extend restriction legislation to Mexicans. But they could not mount enough backing to push a bill curbing Mexican migration. The power of agribusiness and other industrialists employing Mexicans blocked them. Representative James Nance Garner, just to give you an example, from Texas, he comforted the racists by informing them that Mexicans returned home after the picking season. All they want, in his words, is a month's labor in the United States, and that is enough to support them in Mexico for 6 months. They are a docile people. They can be opposed on. The sheriff can go out and make them do anything. But by the eve of the Great Depression, the Mexican and the Chicano economic and political situation worsened. And in this case, we're going to have to deal with a thing called repatriation. New arguments are going to be advanced by the eugenicists. Widespread unemployment, the racial undesirability of the Mexican, his un-Americanism. Now, Dr. Roy L. Garris of Vanderbilt University, a racist, a scientific racist and authority on eugenics, is going to testify before Congress claiming that his science could prove the Mexicans' inferiority. And so he had sent his graduate students to research and report on all major communities in the United States, from San Antonio to Los Angeles, from Denver to Chicago through Detroit. And their dissertations on the Mexican communities became evidence at congressional hearings. Now, I want you to understand that here's what one PhD candidate is going to write about my grandfather's community in El Paso, Texas. This is Segundo Barrio he's going to be writing about. And of course, he earned his degree writing the following about my dad's neighborhood known as Segundo Barrios. Their minds run to nothing higher than animal functions: eat, sleep, and sexual debauchery. In every huddle of Mexican shacks, one meets the same idleness. Hordes of hungry dogs and filthy children with faces plastered with flies, disease, lice, human filth, stench, promiscuous fornication, bastardly lounging, apathetic peons and lazy squaws, beans and dried chile, liquor and general squalor, and envy and hatred of the gringo. Yet there are Americans clamoring for more of this swine to be brought over from Mexico. Again, great science, no? So the restrictionists are going to win their battle, as the Send the Mexican Back to Mexico movement inspired President Herbert Hoover. It was foreigners who were responsible for the Depression. It was foreigners who were responsible for white unemployment. It was foreigners who were responsible for the problems that Americans faced. And of course, most foreigners are un-American. And in this particular case, the favorite scapegoat of the Depression was the presence of Mexican workers in the United States. So Mexicans are going to be the first to be blamed for America's ills. So when the Great Depression hit, the United States is going to create a program known as repatriation. Hoover's Secretary of Labor, William Doak, requested funds for the expansion of the Border Patrol and encouraged local authorities throughout the Southwest and Midwest to devise programs for the deportation of Mexicans. And so I wore my shirt to honor this generation. And if you can take a look, it just says, I just look illegal. It's not something that's today, it's something that's going to happen during the Great Depression. So let's go see what happened in a small mining community in Arizona at this time.
A lot of the Anglos that were in high position would take advantage of a lot of the Chicanos, like pointing the finger at them or trying to make them feel inferior. I remember I was about 10 years old, and I was coming from the post office with one of my uncles. We were coming by, and this guy by the name of Pete Riley, who was a druggist right across the river. And he was driving a 29 Dodge. He slammed on the brakes because we tried to cross there, and said, "You goddamn dirty Mexican, next time you do something like this, I'm gonna kick your ass up and down the railroad tracks." And that engraved in me for years and years and years.
For the next decade, the Mineros, isolated and powerless, could do little to improve their situation. But the worst was yet to come. In 1931, at the beginning of the Depression, the bottom dropped out of the copper market. Phelps Dodge closed down the mines. Of 3,000 formerly employed miners, only 42 had jobs. 8 million people across the United States were out of work. In the Southwest, Mexican Americans became scapegoats for the economic crises.
America's problems were due to the fact of the economy being in such a depressed state. America's problems were blamed on the immigrants themselves. And in this case, again, it was the Mexican.
The administration of President Herbert Hoover announced that strict enforcement of immigration laws would help solve the national unemployment problem. Mexicans, who had been encouraged to cross the border openly for decades, were the immediate target. The government moved swiftly to deport any Mexicans whose citizenship could be questioned. The program was called repatriation.
What started out perhaps as a very mannerly order turned out to be a total helter-skelter way of sending Mexicans back home. Mexicans were rounded up illegally. Mexicans were just shipped back. Many of these Mexicans were Americans. They were born in the United States. They were naturalized legally.
Los mineros, who by now had deep roots in the U.S., were no longer wanted. Little distinction was made between those born in Mexico and those born in the United States. Some escaped being deported through pure luck.
My mother was expecting my youngest brother, Richard, and we were not able to get on that train. My youngest brother was born the next day, so that kept us from going back to Mexico.
Phelps Dodge assisted with the repatriation effort. They provided the trains to carry the mineros away.
Most of them wouldn't argue because they knew they would suffer at the end. One way or other, they'd get a hold of them, you know, where they would make them wish they had gone.
There's nothing I could do. I just took those people around the border of Mexico. The PD and the Red Cross was paying me for that. And they gave me some money to give those people when I unload everything they had. All I had to do, unload trunks or boxes, whatever they had. It's something.
Okay, so you can understand and appreciate something with regards to the repatriation movement. And let's remember the national character and its attitude towards Mexico, towards Mexicans. Because it's not just Arizona, but the entire country. And again, the mass media can stir up public opinion. And all you need is hysteria. It creates this anti-immigrant experience. In this particular case, white beans, black beans, yellow beans, red beans, all of the beans in this era are going to begin to view Mexicans, the brown beans, as problematic. So let's understand the patterns of immigration history. It reveals the cycles of change that will continue to the present day. So let's understand this very clearly with regards to the cycles of change in immigration policy. Whenever there are economic labor necessities in the United States, the remedy becomes Mexican migration, which stimulates a movement to the U.S., and stimulates a movement of people to the United States. And again, let's reveal the cycles of change in immigration policy. Students, please understand this. Whenever there are economic labor necessities in the United States, the remedy becomes Mexican migration, which stimulates a movement of people to the United States. When those labor needs are satisfied, there oftentimes occurs an economic downturn, which results in immigration restriction and deportation. So this process occurs again when the United States is in need of labor. It is important to understand this cycle because it occurs numerous times in the 20th century. Today's controversy is but a reflection of this historical cycle. It is not anything new, but it is a part of the experience for every generation. And if you're a Mexican, it has to be faced. Again, my grandparents faced it, my parents faced it, I face it, my children will face it. Again, the cycles of change in immigration policy. The important thing about economic labor necessities in the United States, the remedy becomes Mexican migration. When the labor needs are satisfied, there occurs an economic downturn, which results in immigration restriction and deportation. This is a cycle. It occurs again when the United States is in need of labor. So this cycle, we begin this cycle. The 1930s introduces us to this cycle. And of course, Los Angeles served as the model repatriating city. Let's go to Los Angeles and understand what happened to the people.
closing time, the close of an era. In the 1920s, the great American word was prosperity. Now the 30s have begun and there is a new word, depression.
As the Depression deepened, competition for scarce jobs grew fierce. In laundries, factories, construction companies, Mexican workers were replaced by U.S. citizens.
Devastating is a good adjective to use for Mexicans in Los Angeles in the Depression. Very quickly, by 1931, half the population is unemployed, much larger than the general Los Angeles population. That means a lot of the people that had had fairly secure employment before this period now are out of work.
My father lost a job. He didn't want to receive relief. He didn't want to receive it. He wanted to work. But like I said, there was no work for Mexicans. At least my mother was working as a maid in a wealthy family.
President Hoover, by 1931, is desperate to stay in office. He is roundly blamed for the Depression, and he begins to look for scapegoats. And it's his Secretary of Labor who begins to say, well, if we simply got rid of Mexicans, we would have jobs for everyone else. Los Angeles begins to target the Mexican community. The first ever immigration raid is done at the plaza. Immigration authorities are brought in from other places to kind of surround the plaza. They end up capturing as many Japanese or Chinese Americans at the plaza than they do Mexicans. And they deport 15 people that day. But what they wanted to do is scare people, and they accomplished that. In the weeks following that immigration raid, people were scared to go to work. They were scared to go outside. This created a great panic, not only among the Mexican community, but also among their employers.
In Los Angeles, the Mexican consul suggested that instead of persecuting Mexicans, the city buy train tickets for anyone willing to return to Mexico, now peaceful a decade after the end of the revolution.
Initially in 1931, when they start this, they have no problem filling the trains. There are plenty of people who are unemployed, who want to go back. By 32, they have trouble filling the trains, and that's when more coercive measures start to be used. County welfare officials begin to target certain neighborhoods that they know have a large number of unemployed Mexicans. They will go house to house. They will say, the cheese that you're getting, the bread we have been giving you is no longer going to be made available to you. Instead, we will give you this one ticket, and this is for a ride back to Mexico on a train. This is your only choice. You will get no more assistance.
For the Castañedas, the knock on the door came early in 1935, not long after tragedy struck the family.
My mother got sick with TB, and she died. She died in 1934, the 10th of May. I was making my first communion that day when my mother died. I remember when they buried her. I remember that they had to drag me out of there because I was so emotional what was happening to her, what was happening to us.
Natividad Castañeda was offered 3 tickets for himself and his 2 American-born children on a train going to Durango in northern Mexico.
We had a trunk, a big trunk, and the first thing that he put in there was his working tools. That's what went in there, and a couple of blankets that we had, a few cooking utensils and dishes, and what little clothing we had. Because we lost everything. We arrived at the train station that was very crowded. People crying, children and adults. I was approached by a man. He says that I could stay here, but I would become a ward of the state. You know, like you hear about these orphanages. I didn't want to be in an orphanage. I wanted to be with my father and my brother. I had a family.
Between 300,000 and 500,000 Mexicans and Mexican Americans are forced out of the United States in the 1930s. There are plenty of Americans who said, we don't want the European immigrants anymore. There are plenty of Americans who said, we don't want any Italians, we don't want any Poles, we don't want any Jews. But there was never an action to round them up en masse and to send them back to their home countries. And this is what happened to Mexicans.
We went to live with this tia, my father's aunt. We really weren't welcome because, you know, there wasn't much room even for them. So we had to live outdoors, sleep outdoors. Pouring rain.
Okay, so we can appreciate something with regards to the experience here. Now, the stock market crash of 1929, which marked the beginning of the Great Depression, came directly from wild speculation which collapsed and brought the whole economy down. The bubble of prosperity that was built on the mini-industrial revolution where new industries appeared around consumer goods had burst. And on October 1st, 1929, a massive fall in the stock market occurred, which caused a run on the banks. So the boom of the mid-1920s based on housing and automobiles slowed, and despite the lack of demand, overproduction continued. So capitalism was in a crisis, and after the crash, the economy was stunned, barely moving. Historians see that it was the maldistribution of income that was a significant factor that contributed to the Great Depression. Many American businesses misrepresented their assets to obtain loans, and as a result, they were overburdened with debt. The prevailing thought in 1929 concerning economic depressions was that economic downturns are natural and simply must be allowed to run their course. Whereas before downturns were related to overproduction, now underconsumption was caused by falling wages and rising unemployment. But by 1929, many Americans could no longer buy the products they needed and wanted. So it's very important to understand and appreciate that those responsible for the economy didn't know what had happened. They were baffled by it and they had refused to recognize it. And again, no protections were built into the economy. Economic historian John Kenneth Galbraith argued that speculation led to the crisis due to the lack of business regulation, due to the unhealthy corporate and banking structures, to unsound foreign trade, and much and deliberate economic misinformation. There was a bad distribution of income where the highest 5% of the population received about 1/3 of all personal income. I think this sounds familiar. Again, the cycles of change in history. But Herbert Hoover, not long before the crash, boasted that America was near to the final triumph over poverty. But all over America, haphazardly created neighborhoods of shacks were built on garbage dumps. They're going to be called Hoovervilles. Herbert Hoover and the Republican program did not reach out to the majority of the suffering poor. In fact, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation under the Hoover administration was designed to bail out his political patrons at the outset. And then, of course, Mexicans are going to be blamed for the Depression. So Herbert Hoover did nothing to alleviate the plight of the workers. Republicans were not interested in helping workers. They were interested in helping businesses. And there were millions of tons of food around, but it was not profitable to transport it, not profitable to sell it, so it rotted in the fields. There was warehouses full of clothing, but the people who could not afford it to keep warm, so the clothing was not distributed. People froze to death. And there was houses. There was a housing boom in the 1920s, but these houses stayed empty and people lived in these shacks because they couldn't pay the rent. They had been evicted and they now lived in these shacks quickly formed as Hoovervilles that were built on garbage dumps. So you had nice neighborhoods that were just rotting, nobody living in them, and then garbage dumps. Now the Hoover Institute at Stanford University, of which I went to, houses Hoover's papers on Pacific Rim countries and Asiatic trade. It stands tall amidst the campus infrastructure. It is euphemistically referred to by students as Hoover's last erection. Let's visit a documentary that helps us appreciate Hoover's conservative approach to the inherent cyclical crisis in capitalism.
Millions of American workers lost their jobs. 1 out of every 4 workers was jobless. Only a handful of wealthy investors profited from the collapse of the stock market, like President John F. Kennedy's father, Joseph P. Kennedy, or brilliant investor and presidential advisor Bernard Baruch, who became legendary as the man who sold out before the crash. Performer and humorist Will Rogers probably put it best.
10 men in our country could buy the whole world, and 10 million can't buy enough to eat.
So the millions of less fortunate Americans faced a grim and uncertain future. Soup kitchens and bread lines became as commonplace as the flappers and speakeasies of the Roaring '20s. And Herbert Hoover's campaign promise of a chicken in every pot couldn't have been farther from the truth. America's towns and cities struggled in vain to help the thousands in need. The jobless became the homeless. Shanty towns, makeshift communities of shacks constructed from wooden crates, tar paper, and cardboard sprang up. Disillusioned citizens called them Hoovervilles after the president, and the newspapers they slept under, Hoover blankets. Others left the city to ride the rails, looking for work. Too poor to purchase train tickets, they hitched rides on freight cars, hoping they wouldn't be caught, hoping they'd find a job. Approximately 2 million men became hobos, wandering the countryside looking for work. Between 1929 and 1932, roughly 400,000 farms were foreclosed when farmers couldn't pay their mortgages and banks repossessed the property. Thousands of farm families became migrant workers, following crop harvests to eke out a living. Then, to make matters even worse, drought, coupled with the overproduction of crops in the Great Plains, turned the area from Texas to Oklahoma into a dust bowl. In 1934, strong winds blew tons of dust from the plains all the way to the East Coast. Dust even coated New York City and settled on ships 500 miles out to sea in the Atlantic Ocean. Unemployment and poverty hurt everyone, especially children. Many left school to work and help their families survive, and many more went hungry and malnourished. Diet-related illnesses like rickets and scoliosis became all too common. Once again, President Hoover tried to reassure the nation by saying, recovery is just around the corner. But it was not to be, and more Americans grew disenchanted with his policies and administration. Secretary of the Treasury Andrew Mellon echoed the beliefs of most of Hoover's advisors that the economy would recover on its own. Hoover thought the government must take some action, but feared making government too strong, and so he chose a conservative approach, calling together business, banking, and labor leaders and urging them to work together and avoid laying off workers or calling strikes. Then he authorized the expenditure of federal funds for large public works projects, like Boulder Dam, later renamed Hoover Dam, to create jobs and wages for thousands of workers. Hoover felt giving direct help to needy Americans would undermine their self-respect and looked to private charities to help the hungry. Instead, he approved more than $2 billion in emergency financing to businesses, hoping their renewed success would trickle down to the people who needed assistance. It didn't. Rather, unemployment rose even higher, and Americans were caught in a web of despair.
Okay, so that's why Americans think that they're Egyptian. They live on Denial River. And in this particular case, they want to find somebody to blame for their problems, and so Mexicans are going to be the first to be blamed. This ends session 8. We'll see you for next week. Thank you very much.